Welcome to Part 2, Darwin's Descent with Modification. So the skills to master for the exam are define adaptation, natural selection, and fitness. Describe the observations and inferences made by Darwin on his voyage. Okay, so Darwin was hired to go on this boat right out of college, and he was hired as the naturalist because he had a background in fossils, in geology, and in botany. So that's why he was hired, and he got along really well with the captain. So they started off here in England and went down to South America. So the Galapagos Islands are on this side, but they also stopped along the Andes Mountains here and along both the east and the west coast of South America. While in the Andes Mountains, Darwin, who has background in fossils, he discovered that there was an earthquake, and there's fossils here, high in the mountains, fossils from ocean organisms, so like fish and shells. And this was absolutely incredible to him. So this was the result of an earthquake that shifted the mountain and pushed rocks several feet up in the air. So he got to see several layers down, and he saw stuff from the ocean. You know, and they're kind of close to the ocean, but they're several kilometers away. So this is quite far, and this is really up. How did these organisms get there? And remember, Darwin's been very influenced by the works of Hutton and Lyell. And so when he saw all of these layers and all of these ocean organisms, Darwin is able to conclude that the Earth is not young, but the Earth is old. So he believes in this old world hypothesis proposed by Lyell. So this supports the old world hypothesis, and that's really important because if the world is very old, that gives us lots of time for these organisms to change over time. Next up, he went to the Galapagos Islands, and what he discovered there was that the animals were definitely distinct species, but also very similar to the mainland. So the Galapagos Islands, which are over here, is very similar to the animals on the mainland. Those on mainland. Okay. So what Darwin concluded from that was that the mainland animals populated the islands originally. Mainland animals moved to the island, but once they were on the island, they diversified. Because the Galapagos is actually really kind of diverse and unique place. Each island has its own unique vegetation, has its own unique climate, and all these islands, even though they're very close geographically, they're very different from each other in terms of the environment. So keep that in mind. They have very different environments. So one of the best examples of this is probably his finches. So all of these are from different islands on the Galapagos. And basically no one recognized how similar they were until Darwin came along. So they do look extremely distinct, and each one of these has a different beak for different type of food found on the island, and different feathers for their different nesting places. So this is an example of how animals have really adapted to their environment. So let's go ahead and define adaptation. Okay. Adaptation. So again, this is inherited characteristics. Inherited characteristics that enhance survival in a certain area. Okay, so not only survival, but also reproduction. The ability to have babies. That's important. Okay, so each one of these finches is an example of adaptation because they're different beaks. They have different food sources on the different islands. So these different traits are an example of adaptation. And because this is inherited, these beaks would then be passed along to their offspring. Okay. And so these characteristics arise through natural selection. So natural selection is the idea that individuals with certain traits survive in an environment better. For example, if one of these birds flew to a different island, if this big-beaked bird that uses its beak to crack seeds flew to the island where there's all these little beaked birds that use their beaks to crack open smaller seeds instead of bigger seeds, this individual would not have the characteristics needed to get enough food. And if you don't get enough food, either you die or your children will die. So that's the idea of natural selection. It's the individuals with certain traits survive and reproduce better. And some people consider this like natural selection survival of the fittest. Reproduce better. And so let's define fitness. Okay, so survival of the fittest is something you've probably heard before. What fitness actually means in this sense is the ability to reproduce. Okay, so this is not talking about you getting swole at the gym. This is talking about your ability to have babies. So the survival of the fittest is another way to say natural selection, is that individuals with good traits for the environment survive and have more babies. Survival of the ones that can have most babies. And the natural selection is determined by adaptation. What adaptations does the individual have? What inherited characteristics help you to survive and reproduce better? Help you to survive and do survival of the fittest. Not the swollest, the fittest. This leads us to observations by Darwin. So his first observation, and you can observe this too by looking to your right, looking to your left. Members of a population, like our human population, vary in their inherited traits. You're not going to find two identical anythings. And the second observation is that all species can produce more offspring than their environment can support. This is just true. They have the ability, like if you can survive in your environment, you can have as many babies as you want, basically. But many of those offspring fail to survive and reproduce. So even though you're having all of these children, it's very unfortunate that not 100% of children grow up to be an adult for one reason or another. So Darwin put all of these observations together and came up with these inferences. Inference number 1. Individuals whose traits give them a higher chance of survival. Those who are better adapted to the environment. Those who are more fit. They have a higher chance of survival and end up having more babies. And the second inference is that this unequal ability to survive and reproduce, because life is not always fair, leads to the accumulation of favorable traits. So if you think about this another way, you are the product of evolution. You have more favorable traits than any of your ancestors, and that's kind of cool to think about. But it's also cool to think about in the world around us. All of these animals are supremely suited to their environment. That's one of the observations that we made. And it's because they've acquired these traits through generations that make them survive in their environment better and be more fit, have more babies. Okay, so that's where we're at with evolutionary thought. And don't forget, bring all of your questions to lecture so that we can go over them and make sure that you understand all of these concepts.